It's just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time. Just be respectful, dudes.
Hey, welcome to the Baltimore Bureau podcast for the first time, also in video, from The Real News. I'm Dharna Noor. I didn't do what I said I was going to do at all. All right.
And I'm Baynard Woods, and we work here at The Real News on the Baltimore Bureau, and every week on Friday we bring you what we've been doing over the course of the week. This week is a particular... yesterday on the 12th is the anniversary of the day that Freddie Gray was arrested, put into the back of a van, and put into a coma by police. And so next week we're going to have a special Freddie Gray episode, whatever you call a thing that is a podcast. And we will we'll reflect on that a little bit with some people next week. But this week we've got a lot on the legislative session.
Yeah, the legislative session wrapped up this past Monday. So the first story you're going to hear is from our reporters Stephen Janis and Taya Graham, who did sort of a wrap-up of all of the things that went wrong this past legislative session. So let's go to that.
Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Annapolis, Maryland. If anyone was hoping that progressive reforms would win the day in this Democratic state, they needed to come to the last day of session in Annapolis, sign a die.
From a bill that would stop the city from auctioning off houses over a past due water bill.
It's very discouraging, and the attempt is to mislead the public that something is being done in water and to actually set things back.
To a package of new laws that would impose mandatory sentences for the second possession of a handgun.
We have a choice to make. Do we want to go backwards with policies that haven't worked?
The Maryland legislature continued to bolster an agenda that advocates say is going in the wrong direction.
First off, in terms of mandatory minimums as a tactic and methodology to decrease crime is ineffective. All the sociological and historical evidence from the past 20, 30 years shows that tough on crime legislation has no correlation to decreasing crime.
A concerted effort to contravene progress, says Adam Jackson of the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, even after his group beat back a package of bills that would restore tough on crime policies.
And so that in concert with these new mandatory minimums only reestablishes the status quo in terms of what we think about crime prevention in Baltimore.
The Real News has followed the difficult road to reform in the purportedly blue state for months. Today, on the last day of the session, we went behind the scenes inside this empty Senate Judiciary Committee room where one of the key architects of the tough on crime measures, Democratic Senator Bobby Zirkin, presided over last-ditch efforts to pass the bill.
Now the bill is before you, favorable as amended. Does anybody want to be recorded against the favorable as amended?
A scene that revealed just how hard some Democrats were working to revive the legislation groups like LBS worked tirelessly to defeat.
Shows that tough on crime legislation has no correlation to decreasing crime, and that more investment in community-based institutions and organizations that deter crime is actually the solution.
But the same was true for State Delegate Mary Washington, who worked for 2 years to pass the water bill lien moratorium.
Senators refused to cross-file the bill when I walked in the early days and said, will you cross-file this bill? No city senator would cross-file the bill. Therefore, it went to the House, to the Senate, without a Senate cross-file. And then they send back a bill that has not had a full hearing, that has not had any support, and it's very discouraging.
Who do you think was behind this?
Well, when you look at the bill, it's very clear that the amendments are what the city wanted, and they are exactly what the city has always wanted, was to not really do anything about protecting people against their poor practices.
After the session, the Real News asked Republican Governor Larry Hogan why he focused on get tough laws to battle crime in a city with one of the most corrupt police departments in the country.
Governor, a lot of people said from Baltimore they were concerned about the emphasis on tougher sentences, the problems with the Baltimore Police Department, the problems with law enforcement in Baltimore. Why are you pushing for tougher sentences given those problems? Do you have confidence in your criminal justice system?
Well, it's two different issues. I mean, certainly there's corruption in the Baltimore City Police Department that we have to root out, and that's one issue.
Including the recent gun trace task force scandal, which now includes 9 officers who have pled guilty to drug dealing, racketeering, stealing from residents, and overtime fraud. But the Republican governor said the two issues were separate.
But the other issue is we have some very violent repeat offenders who keep committing crimes over and over again and never do jail time. We have people that have shot people on the streets that get out in 30 days. So everybody pretty much came together and said, while last year we came together in a bipartisan way and passed justice reinvestment, we lowered the prison population by 1,000. We lessened penalties for lesser crimes. But if you're a repeat violent felon that continues to terrorize the streets of Baltimore or anywhere else, we're going to put you in jail and you're going to do time.
A philosophy that revealed the stark divisions between the people who want reform and the leaders who make the final decisions.
Every time something happens, it's a knee-jerk reaction that we have to come up with longer penalties. You understand that more so specifically targets Afro-Americans and people of color. Come on now, that's not being smart on crime. That's being dumbed down stupid on crime.
This is Taya Graham and Stephen Janis reporting for the Real News Network in Annapolis, Maryland.
All right, so that story was a bunch of examples of how Democrats have really failed in Maryland. And we see this in Baltimore City as well, that we're controlled by the Democratic Party, and yet they have so little vision for this city that speaks to the majority of the people in this city. And so there's another story by Stephen Janis and Taya Graham coming up now, where the mayor is asking Goldman Sachs to come and build a movie theater at Mondawmin Mall. And that's where there was the Target that moved out, Target big box store or whatever, and it was where the kids were forced out of public transportation. All the public transportation shut down on April the 27th of 2015, and when they got off of the buses, they were confronted by lines and lines of riot cops, and that led to one of the more intense moments of the uprising, and it's something that we're still fighting through MPIA requests to get footage. Most journalists in the city, The Sun, has been doing really good work at it to get the camera footage of what happened that day at Mondawmin Mall, and they refuse it on the basis of national security and homeland security, that we can't see. It might give terrorists a way to look into the Baltimore subway system that has very few stops and find a way to attack it. So we'll watch some more Democratic failure here as the mayor begs an investment bank to come and save us.
This is Taya Graham reporting for the Real News Network in Baltimore City, Maryland. We have breaking news. Mayor Pugh has announced that she has asked Goldman Sachs to invest money in Mondawmin Mall to build a movie theater. This comes on the heels of the Target closing, which was an anchor to the Mondawmin Mall area.
They were in just last week, didn't say anything about the bonds, did talk about they came in with Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is investing, as you well know, is one of the investors in Port Covington. They're also one of the investors in La Cité. I've also asked them, Goldman Sachs, to take a look at what we're doing at Mondawmin. I asked them to look at the possibility of a movie theater in Mondawmin, so that they are taking a look at that.
So Goldman Sachs might invest in Mondawmin?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
The news about the possible investment in the mall comes after Goldman Sachs has announced a $233 million investment in another Baltimore project, Port Covington. Port Covington is a massive waterfront development project owned by Under Armour CEO and billionaire Kevin Plank. 2 years ago, the city approved a controversial $600 million TIF, or tax increment finance incentive, for the developers to build a veritable city on the water. TIFs allow developers to invest future property taxes in the project, money which is fronted to the developers by floating city-backed bonds. But at the same press conference, the mayor said that developers gave no timeline for the Port Covington project to move forward.
Do you have a timetable on Port Covington at this point? No. Accessing their first round of bonds? No, they were in just last week, didn't say anything about the bonds.
Mayor Pugh hopes that this will revitalize the mall and the surrounding community. The Real News has reached out to Goldman Sachs and will update the story as it develops.
Neither you or I have anything on this week, Darna, because we did some print stories, and Sometime soon, if you're listening to this, go to therealnews.com and see, and we may have a sparkling and shiny, beautiful new website.
Yeah.
On which print stories are really readable and look really good. Thanks to Stephen Frank, who's also doing our engineering and editing for that. And making it not feel like print is sort of worthless. So what did you write about this week?
I actually wrote about something very relevant to what we were just talking about, the kind of failure of Maryland's Democrats to put any real reforms in place. I've been following these two bills that were both set at some point in this legislative session to remove water bills from tax sale in Baltimore. So you can't lose your house over an unpaid water bill. Originally formulated, or your church. Instead of the, more aggressive bill that Delegate Mary Washington put forth this session, the bill that passed was sponsored by Senator Barbara Robinson, and advocates say that it was really, really watered down. I mean, it's only a 1-year moratorium instead of lasting forever. It includes homeowners and renters, but not places of worship. Yeah, you can check that out on the site.
And go back and watch the previous video where you see one of these guys. You can hear it on the podcast from 2 weeks ago. You see one of these guys at the churches who lost his church. And I'm trying to think of a good joke about the bill was so watered down, they must have a giant water bill. Maybe they'll lose the state house or something. But it just... See, that's how you tell a bad joke. You say, I'm trying to figure out a way to tell this joke. And then you're not quite copping to telling the bad joke. And that's sort of what this legislative session in many ways was a bad joke.
There you go.
Tying it all up.
Yeah.
I wrote a story this week about Keith Davis Jr., and this has been going on since 2015. And I want to mention it quickly because he is the first person who was shot by police after Freddie Gray was killed by police. And he was shot at 44 times by police officers, was shot 3 times, still has a bullet in his neck, and is about to face his 4th trial. Marilyn Mosby prosecuting him. And the Civilian Review Board came out this week with very strong condemnation of sustaining complaints of excessive force against 4 different police officers: Lane Eskins, Israel Lopez, Alfred Santiago, and Catherine Filippo. It's important that we put their names out there, I think.
Totally.
And 2 of those, Santiago and Eskins, that recommends that they be fired, and the other 2 were recommended to be suspended for 30 days and receive a strong reprimand. And this could have, that trial's going to start on June the 7th. And so it could really have a huge impact because it says that there's discrepancy between the testimony of the officers in the previous trials and their statements to Internal Affairs, which means that the defense can now move to make those Internal Affairs records discoverable. And so they're entitled to get them in court to know what they said there. And that's a huge victory, not only for the people supporting Keith Davis, but for Maryland and Baltimoreans to be able to see, despite the law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights, to be able to see these internal affairs reports. We have a gubernatorial race that's also going on now, and we have been talking to some of the candidates. I talked to Ben Jealous a little while back about criminal justice, and Jessel Noor has been doing just spectacular reporting on education, and you should check out some of his national reporting on this really big movement where people teachers are going on wildcat strikes all around the country. But he asks one of the candidates this time, who's running for governor, about his education platform. So who does he talk to, Darna?
He talks to Jim Shea, who's polling, I think, at like 1% right now. But he had some interesting things to say about public education. They talked about the Kirwan Commission and his plans for reforming education in schools in Baltimore and Maryland. So we'll hear that now.
And is Jim Shea the dude that Brandon Scott's riding with running as his?
Yeah, Councilman Brandon Scott from Baltimore is running on his ticket.
All right, so going to the 1%ers here.
Primary election day, June 26th, is quickly approaching, and there's a number of candidates in the Democratic field vying to challenge Republican Governor Larry Hogan, the incumbent, in November. Well, at The Real News, we'll be sitting down with all the gubernatorial candidates to discuss their vision for public education. Today, I'm joined by Jim Shea. He is a former chair of the Board of Regents at the University of Maryland. University System of Maryland, the Empower Baltimore Management Corporation, and the Downtown Partnership of Baltimore. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, we've seen a wave of teacher strikes sweep the country from West Virginia to Kentucky to Oklahoma. And one of the key issues facing teachers around the country is teacher pay and compensation and funding for education. Maryland ranks pretty well as far as teacher pay, about 8th in the nation, according to some studies. But the state's own findings have shown that Maryland schools are underfunded by $2.9 billion a year. What will you do to address this? And do you think that this unrest among teachers could spread to Maryland as well?
Well, I have a full comprehensive education plan that calls for restructuring, revamping our K through 12, pre-K through 12, and funding it properly. And one of the key elements of it is to improve the circumstances for our educators. And that means everything from recruiting, educating, training, supporting, developing, peer review, and giving our educators the opportunity to advance without having to leave the ranks of teacher, the classroom. So often we have teachers who do better and better, need a pay raise. They'll either leave or become part of the administration. We need to keep our really great teachers in the classroom teaching, because that's all of us remember our education. It was that great teacher that turned us around. So we rank 8th in teacher compensation. We rank 1st in income. So I don't understand why we wouldn't rank 1st in teacher pay. But more than that, the United States as a whole is way behind the rest of the world in our educational systems and techniques, including particularly how we support our teachers. So being 8 in the United States puts us way down the line on a global platform. So as I say, a key element of my plan would be a career track for teachers that is much improved, including compensation. And sure, if we don't do our job, the teachers will speak out and we will have unrest here.
So Larry Hogan, who you take aim at in your education plan, he says the issue isn't about funding, it's about accountability. His efforts to increase accountability, which is really a key word for deregulation of the public schools, has failed. It's not advanced through in Annapolis. What's your response to Governor Hogan?
Well, I think when Governor Hogan says accountability, what he wants to do is blame people. His reaction to most problems is to point fingers and to blame, say it's somebody else's fault, not his. A true leader takes responsibility. And what accountability really means is identifying where the problems are and helping to fix them. That's the point of accountability. It's not to blame people. It's a red herring as an issue. We as a society, we as a state, we as a community need to work together and need to be led to a much, much more robust education system. Better funded, better organized across the board.
And you mentioned international rankings, where the United States is behind some of the other countries in the developed world. But if you take out the fact, you have to acknowledge the fact that the United States has the highest levels of child poverty, right, in the developed world, and it also has high levels of segregation, which persist. And the 50th anniversary of Dr. King's assassination just passed. It was interesting because a lot of people don't know that when he went to Chicago, he said he faced. He said he's never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hateful as in Chicago when he was working to desegregate public schools and public housing and integrate housing there. If you're elected, will you take on this issue of segregation, which persists in Maryland? And it's not to say that black children can't learn with other black children. It's the fact that segregated schools lack the resources available to schools that have access to more wealth.
Well, you've packed an awful lot into a series of very good questions. Let me start back with one of the early things you said. When you compare the United States' best students, the top quartile, to the rest of the world. This is not trying to take into account the full range of children that we educate. Just take the top portion. We rank well into the third and fourth quartile when you compare us to other industrialized nations. There was a study that showed us out of the 52 industrialized nations, the top students in the United States were behind, considerably behind, the best of the rest of the world. It's a very dangerous situation. So the rationale that we try to educate such a broad group really doesn't hold. We're behind, particularly in the STEM disciplines across the board. I think Dr. King would be very disappointed 50 years later in what he sees in the United States, and we should all be disappointed. We do need to tackle the concentrated poverty and the segregation that exists. It's a product of housing. It's a product of urban policies that have failed. It's a product of a failed education system as well. There's no real opportunity for children in areas of concentrated poverty in this state, and yet the upper echelon is prospering, particularly in the economy of today, and we're pulling ourselves apart. It's the #1 rationale why I'm running for office. We need to come together as a community, and I think public education is the best way to do that.
So right now, the Kirwan Commission, it's been meeting for years now, and it's finalizing its findings, which were delayed, and so this, they weren't addressed this year in Annapolis, but they will be addressed next year. So Kirwan is looking at the issue of funding, and it's using poverty as a proxy, right? It's not explicitly dealing with race. Do you think it should look at racial equity when it's when Annapolis is looking at how to allocate these additional funds, which studies have found it's some $2.9 billion every year that's needed?
Well, I think the income levels do reflect where we need to concentrate our efforts. So I think it's a reasonable proxy, if you will, a reasonable thing to concentrate on. Poor children don't do well of whatever race they are, and we know that. A disproportionate number of poor children are black, and that is the segregation you and I were just talking about. But I think it's a reasonable approach. I think if we can really focus in on those who have the least, we'll do much better. And by the way, the best practices around the world do exactly that. They give the best teachers and the most concentrated resources to the children that have the least. And we're not doing that. In Maryland, our state, where we're pretty complacent about our values, we fund schools that serve high-income children at a higher level than we fund schools that serve low-income children. That's called a regressive system.
And the state's own findings and independent studies have confirmed that.
Yes. We get a D in funding equity.
And so I wanted to push back a little bit on Kirwan, because some of the advocates we've spoken to in Baltimore say that while poverty is a good start to examine opportunity, it doesn't factor in the legacy of segregation, the legacy of mass incarceration that still afflict communities today, especially in places like Baltimore.
Well, I think that's a fair point. I think it's a very fair point. I think it ends up being reflected in poverty, those same factors. But I would not argue with you that is worth a real hard look.
Now, what sets you apart from the other? It's a crowded field in the Democratic primary. What sets you apart from the other candidates?
Well, I think it's two things. One, I think I have executive experience. I've run very large organizations, both public and private. University System is the largest public agency in the state, and the business I built is the largest in Maryland and one of the largest in the world. But secondly, I've looked at the issues in a comprehensive and thorough way. When we talk about education, I have a concrete, well thought out plan to resolve our problems in education and to advance the ball. And I think those two things set me apart. We all want good education. Larry Hogan wants good education. but I have both the skill and experience as well as the plan to get it accomplished.
So I wanted to ask you about charter schools and voucher schools, something that our Education Secretary Betsy DeVos strongly believes in. She has worked to spread them for decades around the country. She was questioned on 60 Minutes and couldn't answer for the fact that after 20 years of those policies in Michigan, Michigan students have the worst gain in achievement in the entire country. Do you believe that this state should adopt, Maryland is a state with some of the strongest regulations on charter schools, should deregulate some of the controls on charter schools in this state?
Well, I think we need to separate, particularly in Maryland, the difference between vouchers and charter schools. We have some very fine charter schools who are doing well, and I think that we should continue to let them innovate in the way they've been doing. But when you talk about vouchers or charter schools that are deregulated in effect, you're talking about a very different thing. The theory there is essentially, I don't want to pay for the education of somebody else's child. And when I hear that, I stop the person. I say, oh, really? Do you fly commercial airlines? And they say, yeah, sure. I say, do you realize that the pilot who landed you safely the last time you flew is somebody else's child? And that's the point. We need, as a society, to educate everyone. And if we do, it helps everyone. So the notion that we should concentrate our efforts on what amounts to separated education systems is not the way to go.
So, to fund Maryland schools the way that studies have found it, you bring up this number, $2.9 billion. You're gonna, whoever is governor next year is gonna need to build support to increase that spending into public schools. Do you think that taxes need to be raised on the wealthy and on corporations to help do that? Or how is that, where is that money going to come from?
I don't think we need to raise taxes. Right now, we are the wealthiest state in the wealthiest nation in the history of the world. Our general revenues are increasing substantially each year. If we had just funded education at the same rate of increase that the general fund has increased, we'd be over $300 million ahead of where we are right now. We have sources of revenue without new taxes that are available. We are phasing in the lockbox on the casino, which was supposed to have been done years ago.
10 years ago is when the voters had on the ballot.
And if we had been doing that, that too would have amounted to a lot of money. There are lots of ways to save money within the school systems by uniting the 24 jurisdictions in procurement. There are new sources of revenue that will be coming available. Marijuana is regulated and will be taxed, and I think there's a lot of money there. Online sports gambling is about to be thrown back to the states, and that will be another source of revenue. There's plenty of revenue. What we need is political will, and you alluded to that in the beginning of your question there. There needs to be a groundswell of support among Marylanders for vastly improving our public education. I think it's there, but it needs to be nurtured and led and developed.
So we talked about teachers and teacher workforce. Do you think that more needs to be done to cultivate a more diverse teacher workforce in the state?
Sure. I mentioned that recruiting good teachers is paramount. We don't have enough teachers. We have too many students per classroom. And we need great teachers, and that by definition means a diverse set of teachers.
And can you talk about what the issue of improving schools? There's so many things in your education platform. Talk about what else you think needs to be done to improve public education in this state.
Well, early childhood intervention is critical. The studies show that a child from a low-income family arriving at kindergarten is 5 to 1 behind a kid from high-income families in vocabulary. And those are the building blocks of learning. So we need much earlier intervention, universal pre-K, and for children of low-income families, probably earlier than 4 years old, surely earlier than 4 years old. I've talked about the teachers. We need to do the same kind of tracking for principals because they're crucial to schools. We need a much better vocational educational system right up through graduation from high school, but including community colleges and apprenticeship programs. And retraining. In our world today, people lose their job when they're 45, 50, 55, want to keep working, but they've lost their job because of innovation. That's a real social cost. We reap the benefits of that innovation, but we need to cover the cost of it, which is retraining. I would say universal retraining for everyone in order to get the skills needed for the jobs of today. And of course, all of that, as we've talked, needs to be funded effectively. And I think the final thing is to look real hard at curricula and make sure that we've got good, solid curricula that are not dependent on a lot of testing. Children and young people need to learn, and it didn't help anybody to spend a lot of time learning how to fill in the dots on a standardized test. We could do a whole lot less of that.
And finally, what effort would you make to engage communities and families and students in further developing and implementing, if elected, your plan to reshape public education in Maryland?
Well, I mean, that's crucial, isn't it? We talked about the will to fund education and whether that would be acceptable. There's a lot more to it than just funding. The involvement of the family in a young person's education, studies have shown, is crucial. So, and particularly in community schools and the programs that we've got substantially involve the families, and I think have shown to be very successful.
All right, well, thank you so much for joining us. Jim Shea, you're going to be in the ballot on June 26th, so thanks so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
All right, so we have two more stories coming up for you today. E.Z. Jackson's been doing some really great cultural reporting, and again, right at the corner of Penn and North, a lot of the things are circling around Freddie Gray. It's on our minds this week. And he goes to the Arch Social Club there and digs into the history of this 100-year-old club that was a private black men's club and still is.
Yeah, and of late, it seems like they've been having some issues with, getting membership, new members, getting younger people to join. But he takes a look at sort of the history of the Arch Social Club and what it's meant to specifically black men in Baltimore and what it continues to mean now.
What's up, y'all? I'm E.Z. Jackson from the Real News Network with another Black History moment. This time we're going to talk about the Arch Social Club. Today, the Arch Social Club sits quietly on the corner of Pennsylvania and North Avenue. Founded in Baltimore in 1905 and officially incorporated in 1912, Arch Social Club has been said to be the oldest continually running black men's club in the U.S. The men who began the club, Raymond A. Coates, Jeremiah S. Hill, and Sam L. Barney, saw the need to create a support system during a time where blacks were excluded from white spaces and faced the hardships of being free when slavery had not very long ago been abolished. Though Baltimore is considered a northern city, much of the systemic racism enforced in the South still pervaded the northern United States. Just a few hours away, in the same state of Maryland, plantations still existed in southern Maryland and on the Eastern Shore. Baltimore was a city where black people could find work, start families, buy homes, but was still not allowed in many white establishments. Segregation was as American as apple pie. The men created a place dedicated to, quote, the social, moral, and intellectual uplift of its members, and in order that charity may be practiced in a Christian-like spirit and true friendship and brotherly love be promoted and maintained. Social clubs were birthed from the reformist movement in Victorian-era Britain as a place where men could hang out with each other without the presence of alcohol. The clubs were divided by class, and their functions evolved. In the U.S., black social clubs like Arch Social Club were founded to build collective economic, political, and social networks for the benefit of their own communities. They helped people build independence in the face of heavy discrimination and segregation. Members of the club joined by invite only and ranged from doctors, lawyers, elected officials, to business owners, pastors, and professors. Not long after Arch Social moved to the current location, the area began to decline. Businesses and venues closed, and throughout the 80s and 90s, the area was hit hard by poverty, drugs, and violence. Still today, Arch Social Club fights to remain in existence. Its funding is scarce, and many of its members have passed away. But the clubhouse continues to push, preserving its history, inviting younger members, and hosting events in spite of the challenges. Arch Social Club celebrated its 100-year anniversary in March of 2012. It is currently the only venue still able to host live music on the historic Pennsylvania Avenue Strip. In April of 2015, Arch Social had a front row seat to the uprising following the death of Freddie Gray, who was murdered while in police custody. Right on the corner of Pennsylvania and North Avenue, protesters gathered, and some even clashed with law enforcement as frustration over systemic racism came to a boiling point, changing conversations about the state of policing and Black Baltimoreans forever. We salute the founders and those that continue the legacy of the Arch Social Club.
All right, so we've got, that was Easy Jackson on the Arch Social Club. We have one more piece, and so get your ears ready, radio listeners, for the dulcet tones, the sweet and smooth midnight voice of a radio legend in Baltimore who is debuting here.
Yeah, this is the very first Real News Marc Steiner show. And he had a guest this week who also talked a lot about education. He spoke with Bill Ayers, who became really well known as an activist in the Weather Underground, but he also writes about education. He's got like a PhD in education, and they spoke about the teacher strikes movements going across this country, and again the need for reform in education and sort of a radical shift to better public education.
And you produced this segment, am I right?
I did.
Producing the Marc
produce
Steiner
this
show
segment. Yeah, so.
Be
Look
careful
out every week for.
You probably can't run for president anymore. You've been in the room with Bill Ayers.
Yeah, exactly.
I think Fox News might find some kind of issue with that.
But I didn't live in his neighborhood like Obama did, so I'm probably okay.
You probably can't afford to live in his neighborhood like Obama did.
Not.
All of the rich old radicals. All right, so let's roll out with the sweet sound of Marc Steiner's voice.
Welcome. This is Marc Steiner. Good to have you with us here on the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network. Now, you know, if you've been watching the news, there have been strikes all across this country from teachers, especially looking in the South, West Virginia and Oklahoma. There's something bubbling in this country. Teachers are standing up and saying enough is enough. It's not just about their money. It's about the investment in education. It's about the children. It's about where we're going as a country. And also, the teachers' unions are one of the most malign unions in the country. And they're going after them to shut them down and kill them. Well, our guest today thinks differently. His name is Bill Ayers. And Bill, of course, was made known because he was in the Weather Underground, but when he came up, he went and got his graduate degree and became a PhD in education and taught at the University of Chicago for a long time.
If we don't unleash our imaginations, we're stuck.
So we're a leading expert in education. He's written numerous books. His latest book is You Can't Fire the Bad Ones, and 18 other myths about teachers unions, and public education that he wrote with Crystal Lauria and his brother Rick Ayers. And this is Bill Ayers.
Nice to be here, Marc. Thank you so much.
So you've written a number of books. This is your fourth? Fifth? Sixth?
No. Keep going. I've written something like 14 books, and I've edited about 12 more.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
That's good.
And I'm not slowing down, so I plan to have a bunch more.
Slow down?
Yeah.
It's not time to slow down.
No, it's not time. I've only got that much time left. I have to keep putting one foot in front of the other.
Like Harriet Tubman said, keep on going.
Exactly.
Keep going.
Keep going.
Right?
Follow that star.
So this book and this struggle right now, I think is really very critical. And let me step out of the book for a moment, because we saw the strike in West Virginia. We see what's happening in Oklahoma. We see teachers standing up across the country in your hometown of Chicago, right? They were the bulwark of the progressive fight in that city. So tell me what you think is going on here. What this battle for survival?
Well, first of all, I don't think anything happens in isolation. And I think the teacher strike in West Virginia, while it surprised everybody, I think it's it's a reminder of that old saying that every revolution is impossible the day before it happens, and the day after it looks inevitable. And when, it doesn't happen in isolation. West Virginia happened in the moment of Black Lives Matter, in the moment of undocumented and unafraid, in the moment of women rising up.
You see a connection?
Absolutely, because you take courage from those things. So people who've been pressed down and marginalized and pushed to the side, suddenly look around and say, look, we've had enough and we're going to do something. And when they stand up, just like every other movement I've ever seen, they begin to think more deeply. They begin to imagine a wider horizon. And then that leads, the people in Oklahoma said quite explicitly, we did this because we were inspired by the people in West Virginia. So we're seeing a wildfire across the red states. And these are states, remember, that are all right-to-work states. They're states that don't give unions much right. They don't allow collective bargaining. And it means that, you know, collective bargaining, for all the other things that it does, it brings some labor peace. What you're seeing here is the opposite of labor peace. You're seeing wildcat strike after wildcat strike, and that's a wonderful and encouraging thing to me. And you also pointed out in your little introductory note that they're not fighting for something small and narrow. They're fighting for public education. You go to Oklahoma and you look at a state that schools meet 4 days out of 7, not 5. They meet 4. The other 2 days, Friday and Saturday, teachers drive Ubers and wait tables in order to make a living. That's an outrage. That's shameful in a country as wealthy as this one. I think I told you once before that my granddaughter's Chicago Public School, 4 years ago, they did away with the art teacher. 3 years ago, they did away with the music teacher. 2 years ago, they closed the library. And last year, they were told to bring their own toilet paper to school. Now, if that's not a big letter message to the families who rely on public education, I don't know what is. They're saying to families, if you can get out, move to the suburbs, go to a private school, go to a charter school, because these schools are not going to serve you any longer. And the West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and Arizona teachers are the first in this round to say, enough. We're not going to do that. Public education is an absolute human right. It's a community responsibility, and we're going to stand for that. I think it's great.
The teachers' unions and struggles around Chicago, San Francisco, Baltimore, Oakland, New York. So what's the connection? These are very disparate cultures, disparate parts of our country. What's the connection between them?
Well, the connection is, I think, a faith in public education, a faith that education really is a human right worth fighting for. I think the teachers in Chicago, who 5 years ago, you know, led an incredible strike against a mayor who was certain he could crush them, and they beat him not just to a draw, they crushed him back.
What we see here is a teachers union that is fighting for the unity of community, students, parents, teachers, and the union itself.
And that union, it's worth noting that the Chicago Teachers Union, which was once a kind of traditional service union, a group of teachers began meeting at picket lines of parents fighting to keep their schools open. They met each other, they began to have a study group. This is about 8-10 years ago. In their study group, they began to read things like Naomi Klein. And they said, you know, enough is enough. Let's run a slate. They ran a slate, they won. And then the state moved against them very heavily. They passed legislation that said you must have 80% affirmative vote in order to call a strike. And they thought that would be the end of the Chicago Teachers Union. In fact, they said this will crush the Chicago Teachers Union. Chicago Teachers Union got 95% vote 5 years ago to be able to go on strike. And they not only did they go on strike, but they went on strike with the full support of parents, which meant that every day for 5 days, we had 20,000 people in downtown Chicago at a rally. And even though they were only by law allowed to talk about wages and benefits, every banner said the schools need a full arts program. The schools need their libraries. We need counselors. We need nurses. In other words, it was a social movement disguised as a labor strike. And I think that's what we're seeing here. I don't think this is just a labor question. I think, you know, the conservatives high on the conservative agenda has always been crushing unions, and public sector unions have been in the crosshairs. And so we have in front of the Supreme Court a case called Janus versus AFSCME, which threatens to take what we now have 27 states in the union, our right to work. Right to work is going to be, or what we call right to work for less, is going to be the law of the land. And the conservatives may come to regret what they'd wished for, because what we're witnessing in West Virginia and these other places is what happens when you don't have an ordinary mechanism to air your grievances and to collectively bargain. You end up with this kind of wildcat. And I'm thoroughly encouraged by it, and I'm confident that it's part of this larger picture that we're seeing, which is resistance to the right-wing lurch that our country's going through.
So, I mean, whenever we talk, and you have a very positive outlook on where things are going, where the movement's going, what can, the
It's a genetic flaw. I can't help it. I can't help it. My mother was a Pollyanna. But
so,
and I must say, I've told you this before, but I'm not optimistic in the sense that I know what's coming. But I'm hopeful because I believe that people, when they have a pillow pressed on their face, eventually they fight back. And that's what I'm seeing now in a way that's hugely encouraging.
Well, that was the question I was going to ask. I mean, so what we're facing, though, is diminishing funds for public education that adversely affects especially urban schools.
Chicago is the third largest school district in the country. This week alone, budgets were slashed by some $45 million at city schools.
I mean, what would be the strategy to fight that back and to turn that around? Because these huge forces arrayed against.
And the question of diminishing funds for public education, that's a choice. That's not an act of God. That's something, I mean, austerity in Chicago, what we say in Chicago is the Chicago schools are broke on purpose. Very much like the public housing in Chicago. You know, 20 years ago they stopped picking up the garbage, and then they stopped fixing the windows, and then they stopped having police respond to calls for help. And eventually 10 years in they say, well, these places are uninhabitable. Yes, they are, because you made them uninhabitable. That's what we're seeing in the schools. So if you pretend that you have no money in a city like Chicago and you refuse to bring in any revenue and you keep cutting the taxes, you know, Oklahoma is a great example. No taxes, no taxes, no taxes. That means no schools. So, I mean, we have to understand that it's intentional, it's policy, and it's based on an underlying kind of ideology that we have to be aware of. And that ideology is individualism unhinged, or one of the ways I think about in education is education a product to be bought and sold at the marketplace, or is it a human right? Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights says every kid across the world has a right to an education geared toward the full development of the human personality. Well, if you believe that, and it's not a product, then we shouldn't have to wiggle around to get a charter school, or we shouldn't have to get a voucher. I want a decent, fully funded, forward-looking public school that I can walk to in my neighborhood in Chicago. And the interesting thing is, those pushing the corporate agenda, those pushing the agenda of do away with the collective voice of teachers, privatize the public space, reduce education to a single metric on a high-stakes standardized test, those people all send their kids to private schools. So it's outrageous that they're asking us to put up for something much less than they would allow for their own children. So that's on the question of education. But I think the blow to labor is serious, but I think there's, hate to do it, but there's a silver lining there too.
Right. Where's that?
I can't help it. And the silver lining is that we've gotten used to, in the last 60 or 70 years, a certain approach to labor organizing, a certain approach to thinking about the organized working class in a certain way. And that has run its course, and the attack on it has been sustained and serious. All it means is that we have to find new ways of organizing. I'll give you an example from my world of education in Chicago. These teachers who organized parents, you know, when the progressive leadership took over the Chicago Teachers Union, they immediately let go all the people who were servicing the contract, and they hired organizers. And those organizers did two things. One is they went to every school and met with every group of teachers. Secondly, they went to every community and knocked on doors with parents. Something brilliant about that, something beautiful about that, because it's not the narrow self-interest of teachers that we're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
We're interested in the institution of public education. So they built the seeds of a social movement.
So I think it's about time for us, Bill, to kind of get to the book.
Okay. Okay.
We
Why
haven't done
not?
yet, right?
Why not?
You can't fire the bad ones. So I mean, and so even the title, that is one of the things they throw out at teachers all the time in teachers' unions. You have this contract, and that's why we can't get rid of you, Bill Ayers, you miserable teacher. You don't know what you're doing, and you're ruining our children.
Exactly.
But your union contract won't let me fire you. I mean, that's
exactly
right.
You got it. But of course, there's so many flaws even in that. I mean, first of all, it's not a union contract. It's a union board contract. It was negotiated between two parties. It's not something that was imposed on somebody. It's something that was negotiated. And I think that's critical. But the more critical thing is who gets to frame the argument. And for the last 4 decades, both political parties, the entire for-profit media, including the liberal media, the New York Times, the New Yorker, National Public Radio, the big foundations, the corporate money has all agreed on a strategy for school reform, so-called school reform, that rests on this idea, I call it corporate school reform, it rests on the idea that education is a product. It wants to do away with the collective voice of teachers. And so anytime a politician gets to the microphone, and that politician could be Arne Duncan or Betsy DeVos, the last
Do you equate
couple
the
of...
two?
I'm sorry?
Do you equate the two?
Well, in this sense, the Democrats and the Republicans have walked down the same road around corporate school reform. And so while Betsy DeVos is indeed a monster, and a monster quite beyond what we've ever seen before.
I hesitate to talk about all schools in general because schools are made up of individual students attending them.
I mean, she wants to do away with public education.
Right.
I think that Arne Duncan and John King laid the pavement. And so I think we shouldn't expect in education or in war and peace or in finance capitalism, we shouldn't expect the Democratic Party to lead the opposition because they've been part of the conspiracy. But there's a couple of interesting things that are worth noting. One is that even though they've had both political parties, and even though they've had, the major media, they have not won the argument. They've not put forward a moral argument that anyone can get a hold of. That is to say, tell me why we shouldn't have public education. Tell me why a kid born on the west side of Chicago shouldn't have a decent school right there. His parents shouldn't have to, run a marathon in order to get him into a decent school. That's the kind of thing that I think, and so we see opt-out, we see these wildcat strikes. That's the resistance to this corporate model, and I think it's important. But the framing of the argument is what we're fighting here. So anytime a politician gets to the microphone and says we need to get the lazy, incompetent teachers out of the classroom, I feel myself nodding dully. What am I going to do? Say, no, the lazy, incompetent one should stay there for my granddaughter. Of course not. I'm against that too. Right. The problem is that they framed the thing in a way that they win the argument. If I get to the microphone and say every kid in a public school in this country deserves an intellectually grounded, morally committed, well-paid, well-rested teacher in the classroom, I win that argument. And frankly, I think that's a truer argument. So one of the things we take apart is this idea of the lazy, incompetent teacher who just hangs around. One example we use is the New Yorker ran a several thousand-word essay called The Rubber Room a few years ago. And it was a lip-smacking portrait deserving of thousands of words about this room in the New York City Board of Education where folks who've been taken out of the classroom because they're so dangerous to kids that they can't be left there, but their case hasn't been adjudicated. So they sit in a room and get paid waiting for adjudication. And it is pretty horrible. And reading it, as I say, it's kind of a lip-smacking look at real pathology. And so, wow, it's a fun read. The problem is that's 0.00005% of New York teachers. Does it really deserve thousands of words? And by the way, they will get fired. They just have a right to due process, just like you do, just like I do.
Let's talk about what these myths say and what they can actually be when it comes to teachers unions, where we need to go. I mean, some of the things you touch on here, the teachers unions are the biggest obstacles to improving education we have today. That they're in the way. They're the ones making the problem.
Right.
They're not teaching our kids adequately. They cannot get our children to pass the tests because they don't teach them properly.
Right.
I mean, it's their fault that students are doing so badly on these standardized tests that they force down the throats of our system.
We cannot be held accountable for things that are out of our control.
If standardized tests is the metric that corporate school reform rests on, then okay, we'll listen to your argument. So they say the unions are killing the students and their test scores are in the toilet because of the unions. Well, let's test that hypothesis. What are the states that have the lowest student test scores on the metric that the corporate reformers prefer? What are the worst states in the union? All the right-to-work states. So Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Florida, West Virginia, Kentucky, those are all the states where the test scores are in the toilet. Those are all the states that don't allow unions. So what about the states that allow unions? Let's take Massachusetts, where virtually every teacher is in a union. They do best. Okay, so you might say, well, there are other variables in Massachusetts and Louisiana, and I would completely agree with you. But I didn't make the assertion that it was the union that was the single cause, the single variable to break out. So I think that we have to take them at their word and then challenge them when we see that they're lying about it, basically. The other thing, and the reason we don't accept standardized tests as the measure of a good education, is the same reason that the elite don't allow standardized tests to be the measure of their little darlings and how they do in the world. But there's a thing we discovered writing this book that I've had a lot of fun with, and it's called Goodhart's Law. You ever heard of it?
No.
It's from economics, and it says something, I love the sound of it. It says, a performance metric only works as a performance metric if you don't use it as a performance metric. Yeah, I love it. If Medicare says the universe we're interested in is good hospitals, and the metric we're going to look at is if you survive major surgery 30 days. Every Presbyterian hospital across the nation, survival rates for 30 days were 99%. 31 and 32, you were on your own because people died then, because the performance metric was easy to realize. What's hard to realize is a good hospital. So we have in Chicago a high school, and the university we're interested in is a good high school, and this charter school claims they send 100% of kids to college. That's the performance metric. Well, they do send 100% of their kids, their graduates, to college. But they push out in sophomore and junior year the kids who aren't going to go to college. And by the way, college is everything from Trump University to Rose's Beauty School. And by the way, those who go to the University of Illinois only last a year. So yeah, they send 100% to college. Is it a good school? You wouldn't send your kids there. So that's what we have to kind of resist, this notion that that the test scores are actually what they claim to be.
So let's talk about what needs to be then,
right,
and what about it takes these myths out. I mean, you're sitting in the studio now in Baltimore, Maryland, and a report just came out that said that Baltimore, and this is a union city, that Baltimore's test scores are at the very bottom of the nation, along with Cleveland and Detroit and several other places.
Probably New Orleans.
They're probably in there as well.
Yeah.
I didn't see but they're in there as well. So. And the battle has been in the city about funding for the schools, which is completely inadequate. We have charter school system in Baltimore that's kind of taken over a lot. And the white charters in the city, the charters run by white people in the city, started by white people in the city, have all the money coming in because they know how to get to the money.
That's right.
Charter schools started by black folks in the city are getting very little money because they don't have access to the same power as white people do when it comes to accessing money. So it's a crisis. And our children in the city that you're sitting at this moment, where we're broadcasting from, are suffering from that. So let's talk about the myths that you raise in the book and how to turn those around for children in Baltimore and Cleveland and Detroit and Chicago.
Right, and let's think about if we had access to the superintendent or to the school board, what would be the kind of questions we would want to put to them? If we had the power to kind of change things, what are the few things we could begin to change right away? And frankly, I think the first question really is what we were talking about when we began, which is, I asked Arnie Duncan this at a research meeting, is education a human right? And since you spent your whole life at the University of Chicago Lab School, and your kids go to that school, what have you learned there?
And your kids went there too, didn't they?
Yes, my kids went there, and
it's a public school. Be clear.
I'm sorry?
It's a public school.
No, it is a private school.
Okay.
And Arnie Duncan's kids went there, and Barack Obama's kids there. So it's a school for the privileged. And I said, what did you learn there that you could apply to the west side of Chicago? And he said that you're comparing apples and oranges. So he said, we have to be realistic on the question of, is it a human right? I don't agree. I think we have to be idealistic, and we have to then get real about realizing our ideals. But yes, the first thing we have to start with is that school is a human right, and then we have to begin to address questions like equitable funding. And we have to, I think one of the starting points is to say, what do the privileged have for their kids that all kids deserve? And so Arnie Duncan, in charge of the nation's schools for 8 years, in charge of Chicago schools for 4 years, moves back to Chicago, can't find a single public school to send his kids to, even though he told the rest of us how these schools ought to be organized. So what does he have at the school he chose? A full arts program, class size capped at 15, and on and on. So, and a unionized teacher corps. So if that's good enough for Arnie's kids, It has to be good enough for the kids on the West Side. And I think we have to demand it. And I said to him when I was having this little discussion with him, I'm not saying you could realize it this week or this month, or maybe even not this year, but is it an aspiration? And if you keep saying, no, it's not, we're going to have a charter school, we give you a voucher, then you're dodging the whole question. I mean, not only is Baltimore City in the toilet in terms of test scores, but it's also, we've resegregated the schools in ways that are terrifying. And that's also not an act of God. That's also an act of policy. So I think, and Arne Duncan was the worst on this. I mean, he used the word forced busing when he was, I mean, so here's a liberal, so-called decent.
And that's a racist dog whistle.
Oh, it's a dog whistle. Right. So he used the word forced busing, which we all remember from George Wallace's days, right? So what I'm saying is, it's not an easy thing to solve, but conceptually it's not that difficult. It's not that complicated. So what we have to do is fight out the ideological questions at the same time that we fight for reforms. And this is no different than any other struggle you and I have ever been in. So Black Lives Matter kids, what they're raising in Chicago is they're raising what would policing look like in a fair and just society? What would it look like in a free society? And they're willing to fight for body cameras, but that's not their goal. Just as Martin Luther King was willing to struggle for busing, but busing wasn't the name of justice. Right. His goal was justice. We have the same problem in education. We can get distracted by saying it's about one thing or another, uniforms or not uniforms, social promotion or not social promotion. No, it's about whether education is a human right. And we are willing to fight for a reform here and there, like community control of the schools in Chicago, which we won for a period of time. I should tell that story very quickly. We fought 25 years ago to win local school councils in the schools, and we had them for 5 years. And that was elected representatives, 8 parents, 2 community people, 2 teachers, had the power of the budget and the power to hire and fire the principal. And the education establishment and the political establishment said, that's crazy. You're going to give the keys of the asylum to the inmates. Well, what did the inmates do when they got the budget? Chicago in 1 year did 2 things with those first local school council elections. One is we doubled the size of African American elected officials in the country. Not in the city.
These boards.
These boards were elected, and they were publicly elected. We doubled the number of black elected officials in the country. And secondly, when the inmates got the money, what did they do? We had 3,000 more teachers at the end of that first year than we had before, because it didn't take rocket scientists to look and say, Miss Adams needs an assistant in the kindergarten. We're going to use our money to hire an assistant. That was brilliant. It was local democracy. Took the mayor about 5 years to snatch it back, and we're still in a struggle. And in the upcoming mayoral election, one of the fights is over whether we should have an elected school board again. And we're going to fight hard for it, because we believe that the problems in a democracy, the solution lies in more, not less democracy. So that's where we're headed. But it doesn't answer the problem or the question completely. There is a huge job to do. The other thing you have to always remember is the schools reflect the society. You want to know what apartheid looked like? Go to the schools in apartheid South Africa. If you saw the schools, you would know what apartheid is. If you knew what apartheid is, you could figure out what the schools would be. Fascist Germany, authoritarian Albania. If you know the system, you'll know what the schools are like. So we have a big problem here, which is the inequality in the society, the hold of white supremacy over our entire history. That still expresses itself. So we can't pretend that we can just do the schools without doing society, but nor can we be in a position where we say we're not going to do anything in the schools until we have a just and fair society. It's interactive, and the schools are always the site of struggle in every society, because they represent the possibility of a different future. And that's why we will always be fighting about education.
And that's why Bill Ayers is here and there, because he's always at the heart of the struggle.
I don't know about that.
You are, but you've been there a long time. So
hanging on by my fingernails.
Ain't we all?
Yep.
So thank you, Bill, for stopping by the studio.
I'm thrilled to see you, Marc.
Really good to see you too, brother.
All right, you just heard the first episode of the Marc Steiner Show on the Real News Network, and that wraps up our podcast for this week.
And they can go and watch that, too, if they want to see Marc and Bill Ayers talking with some also coverage and images over it that help illustrate what they're doing, as with all of these stories. And in fact, this is a thing you can watch us talking about it right now, too. If you're listening to this washing dishes and you really want to know what we're looking like as we're saying this, you can go to your computer right now at therealnews.com and you can click on the video and you can see us lead into this. So we are really trying to accommodate your needs, Baltimore, because we love you so much.
Exactly.
And we love a bunch of other people, too. Who are some of the other people that we love that are helping this come together?
Well, we really love Stephen Frank and Dwayne Gladden, who are probably looking at us smiling kind of awkwardly right now. Stephen produces this show. He engineers this show, also with Dave Hebden, who we also love. And Dwayne Gladden is the reason that you can watch this instead of just listening to it this week if you want to.
And we love Soul Cannon for the theme music. Thank you, Soul Cannon, which is Easy Jackson. Is part of that, along with Matt Frizzell and others. And we also love you, the listener, and perhaps the donor. You could give money to us at The Real News as you're listening to this, if you're feeling good.
Or send us a beer.
Or send us a beer. Rip Freddie Gray.
Rip Freddie Gray.